You're walking across the African savanna. It's roughly 1.5 million years ago. The sun is directly overhead, the kind of heat that doesn't just warm you, it interrogates you. There's no sunscreen. There's no shade structure. There's no SPF 50 in a little travel tube in your bag, because there is no bag. There's just you, your bare skin, and a sun that has been doing this exact same thing to this exact same patch of land for billions of years. And at some point, the skin covering your ancestors stopped being pale and turned almost black. This is the story of human skin color. Where it started, why it changed, and why the popular version of this story you probably learned, that humans started black and gradually turned white as they spread across the planet, is both kind of true and dramatically oversimplified in ways that recent genetics has completely blown up. Let's start at the actual beginning, because the actual beginning will surprise you. Here's the thing nobody tells you about early human ancestors. Before we talk about dark skin or light skin, we have to talk about fur, because for most of our evolutionary history, we had a lot of it. Our early ancestors, the ones who looked more like modern chimpanzees than modern humans, were covered in hair. And underneath that hair, their actual skin was very likely pale. We know this because that's what we see in living primates today. Chimpanzees have dark hair, but pull back the fur and the skin underneath is light, almost pink in places. Fur does the job that dark skin pigmentation does. It blocks ultraviolet radiation before it ever reaches the skin. So if you're covered head to toe in hair, your skin doesn't need its own defense system. There's no selective pressure pushing it toward dark pigmentation, because the sun never actually touches it. So the real starting point of this story isn't dark skin, it's fur. And the moment that mattered wasn't skin color changing, it was fur disappearing. Somewhere between 2 million and 1 million years ago, something happened to our ancestors that fundamentally changed how the sun interacted with their bodies. They started losing their body hair. The leading explanation involves a different kind of survival pressure entirely. As early hominins like Homo erectus became more active hunters and long-distance walkers on the open savanna, their bodies needed a better cooling system. Thick fur traps heat. A mostly hairless body covered in sweat glands can dump heat far more efficiently through evaporation. Losing the fur let our ancestors run, hunt, and travel during the hottest parts of the day without overheating. But that created an entirely new problem. Bare skin under direct equatorial sunlight is incredibly vulnerable. Ultraviolet radiation damages DNA, it causes skin cancer, and critically, it destroys folate, a B vitamin essential for cell division, fertility, and healthy fetal development. A population of hairless humans living under intense UV exposure with no protection would face serious reproductive consequences. So evolution did what it does. It found a workaround. Melanin, the pigment responsible for dark skin, acts like a built-in, full-body sunscreen. It absorbs and scatters UV radiation before it can do damage underneath the skin. Humans with more melanin production, meaning darker skin, were protected. They had healthier pregnancies, fewer cancers, and ultimately more surviving descendants. Within a relatively short evolutionary window, natural selection pushed the entire human population toward high melanin production. Dark skin wasn't a fashion choice or a random trait. It was a life-or-death adaptation to losing our fur under an unforgiving sun. This means that for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, every single human being on Earth had dark skin because every single human being on Earth lived in or near equatorial Africa, under that same unforgiving sun. So yes. To answer the headline question directly, the ancestors of every human alive today, every population, every continent, every ethnicity, were dark-skinned. This isn't a contested fringe theory. It's about as close to settled science as paleoanthropology gets. The interesting part, the part that gets messy and surprising, is what happened next. Around 70,000 years ago, give or take, groups of humans began migrating out of Africa in significant numbers. They moved into the Middle East, then into Europe and Asia, eventually reaching every habitable continent. And as they moved, something important changed around them. The sun changed. Near the equator, sunlight hits the Earth almost directly overhead. The UV exposure is intense and consistent year-round. But as you move toward higher latitudes, toward places like Northern Europe or Scandinavia, the angle of sunlight becomes shallow and weak. UV radiation drops dramatically, especially in winter months, when in some regions it nearly disappears for weeks at a time. This created a brand new evolutionary problem, and it's the mirror image of the one our hairless ancestors faced in Africa. Dark skin is an excellent UV blocker, but that same blocking ability becomes a liability when there isn't enough UV to block. Humans need sunlight to produce vitamin D, a nutrient essential for bone health, immune function, and calcium absorption. Dark, heavily pigmented skin filters out so much UV radiation that in low sunlight environments, it can prevent the body from producing enough vitamin D to stay healthy. Severe vitamin D deficiency causes rickets, a disease that softens and deforms bones. In a population trying to survive harsh northern winters, weakened bones and compromised immune systems were a serious liability. So once again, natural selection stepped in, but this time pushing in the opposite direction. Populations that migrated into low UV environments and evolved lighter skin, allowing more UV penetration and more vitamin D production, had a survival advantage. Over thousands of generations, this advantage accumulated, and lighter skin tones spread through populations living at higher latitudes. This is the standard story, and it's broadly correct. But here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the genetics of how this happened reveal something the simple version completely misses. If you assumed that light skin is one trait that evolved once and then spread outward like a single invention, the genetics say otherwise, and this is one of the more remarkable discoveries in recent human evolutionary biology. European populations and East Asian populations both evolved lighter skin compared to their equatorial ancestors, but they did it using largely different genes. In European populations, variants in genes like SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 became widespread, dramatically reducing melanin production. In East Asian populations, a different gene, OCA2, along with other variants, drove a separate but parallel reduction in pigmentation. This is what biologists call convergent evolution. Two populations facing a similar environmental problem, namely low UV and the need for vitamin D synthesis, arrived at a similar outward result, lighter skin, through largely independent genetic paths. Nature didn't reuse the same solution. It solved the same problem twice, with different tools in different populations at different points in time. This alone should reframe how you think about skin color. It's not a single sliding scale from dark to light controlled by one dial. It's the product of multiple separate genetic systems, each shaped by its own regional environmental pressures. Here's where the story gets genuinely shocking, and it comes from ancient DNA, the same kind of technology that's rewritten huge portions of human history in just the last 15 years. For a long time, scientists assumed that light skin in Europeans evolved relatively soon after humans arrived in Europe, tens of thousands of years ago. It made intuitive sense. Get to a low-sun environment, evolve light skin quickly, problem solved. Then, in 2018, researchers analyzed the genome of a roughly 10,000-year-old skeleton found in Cheddar Gorge, England, nicknamed Cheddar Man. The analysis revealed something nobody expected. Cheddar Man, despite living in Britain for thousands of years after the migration into Europe, likely had dark to brown skin alongside blue eyes. This wasn't a one-off anomaly. Multiple ancient European skeletons from the Mesolithic period, the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe for tens of thousands of years before the spread of agriculture, show genetic signatures for darker skin than modern Europeans. The light European skin we associate with the region today appears to have spread much later, arriving and intensifying with waves of migration tied to the rise of farming, particularly populations moving in from Anatolia and the Near East, roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. In other words, light skin in Europe isn't some ancient, immediate consequence of arriving on the continent. It's a comparatively recent development, several thousand years in the making, layered on top of populations who remained relatively dark-skinned for a very long stretch of European prehistory. This timeline genuinely surprised researchers who specialize in this field. It means the simple mental image of humans leave Africa, quickly turn pale once they reach Europe, is wrong. The actual process was slower, messier, and tangled up with later population movements and the spread of agricultural societies. If the vitamin D explanation were the whole story, you'd expect every population living at extreme northern latitudes to have evolved very light skin. But that's not what happened, and the exception teaches us something important. Indigenous populations in the Arctic, such as the Inuit, retained relatively dark skin despite living in environments with extremely low UV exposure for much of the year. Why didn't the same evolutionary pressure apply? The answer comes down to diet. Traditional Inuit diets were extraordinarily rich in marine animals, fish, seals, whales, all of which contain very high levels of vitamin D naturally. When you're already getting abundant vitamin D from food, the evolutionary pressure to lighten your skin for sun-based vitamin D production simply isn't there. The selective advantage of lighter skin only matters when vitamin D is scarce and sunlight is the main available source. This single exception quietly demolishes any version of the story that treats skin color as a simple, automatic response to latitude. It's not really about how far north or south you live. It's about the relationship between available UV radiation and available dietary vitamin D. And that relationship varies depending on what a population actually eats. Here's a curveball most people never hear about. Neanderthals, who lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, also appear to have evolved lighter skin and, in at least some populations, red hair, through their own separate genetic mutations, unrelated to the ones that produced light skin in modern humans. This means lighter pigmentation evolved independently at least 3 separate times in human and near-human history, once in Neanderthals, and twice more in modern humans, separately in European and East Asian lineages. When modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, which we now know happened repeatedly, some Neanderthal genetic variants related to skin and hair did pass into modern human populations and persist today. So even the genes carrying light skin in modern Europeans aren't a single unified inheritance. They're a patchwork, partly from independently evolved modern human variants, and partly inherited from an entirely different, now extinct human species that solved a similar problem on its own tens of thousands of years earlier. Let's go back to the actual question, because at this point we can answer it properly, with the nuance it deserves. If you're asking whether the deep ancestors of every human population alive today, going back roughly 1 to 2 million years, had dark, heavily melanated skin as an adaptation to losing body hair under intense equatorial sun, then yes. Unambiguously yes. This is well supported by genetics, anatomy, and the basic physics of UV radiation and melanin. Every human lineage on Earth traces back to dark-skinned ancestors in Africa. If you're asking whether humans then turned white in some clean, simple linear progression as they spread across the globe, the honest answer is no, not really. What actually happened was messier and more interesting. Different populations, facing different combinations of UV exposure and dietary vitamin D access, evolved lighter pigmentation independently, through different genes, at different speeds, and in some cases, thousands of years later than previously assumed. Some populations in low UV environments never evolved especially light skin at all, because their diet made it unnecessary. And the very recent ancient DNA evidence suggests that even within Europe, the timeline of becoming pale stretched out far longer than the old textbook version implied. There's also something worth sitting with here. The categories we use today, black and white, are modern social and cultural constructs layered onto what is, biologically, a continuous gradient of pigmentation shaped by thousands of generations of regional adaptation to sunlight and diet. Human populations don't divide into 2 genetically distinct boxes. They form an unbroken spectrum, and that spectrum exists because melanin production is a finely tuned biological response to a very specific environmental input, the amount of UV radiation a population's ancestors experienced over deep time, balanced against how much vitamin D they could get from what they ate. There's something worth remembering every time this topic comes up. Skin color is one of the most visually obvious traits separating human populations, and it's also one of the most recently evolved, most superficial, and most thoroughly studied at the genetic level. We understand almost exactly which genes are involved, when they likely arose, and why in terms of pure evolutionary pressure. And what that genetic record actually shows is a story of adaptation, not hierarchy. Dark skin was the original, necessary defense against a punishing equatorial sun. Lighter skin was a later, regional adjustment that let populations survive and thrive in environments where that same defense became a liability instead of a benefit. Neither is more evolved or more advanced than the other. Both are solutions, arrived at independently, multiple times, by the same species responding to different versions of the same basic problem. How much sunlight do I need? And how much can I afford to block? So next time you're out in the sun and you notice your skin reacting to it, tanning, burning, staying exactly the same, you're watching a multi-million-year-old system still doing its job. The melanin in your skin right now is running code written by natural selection on the African savanna, edited regionally over tens of thousands of years by ice age winters, fishing diets, and migrations most of your ancestors never could have imagined. Every human walking around today, regardless of how dark or light their skin happens to be, is carrying a living record of where their ancestors stood under the sun and how long they stood there.